Okay, so this is your introduction to quadratic equations, and our whole goal is to learn how to solve a quadratic equation. Now, the first thing you need to understand is you need to be able to identify a quadratic equation when you see one. Quadratic equations are usually in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, but really any equation where it's a second degree polynomial, in other words, the highest degree is squared, would be a quadratic equation. For example, I could have x plus 2 all squared plus 16 equal to 0. That could be a quadratic equation. So quadratic equation just means that it's a second degree polynomial. In other words, the highest degree is squared, and it's an equation. For something to be an equation, it has to have an equal sign. Okay, so the highest degree here is squared, and it has an equal sign. Okay, now all you've solved in the past have been linear equations like this: 2x plus 5 equals 10. Okay, and linear equations are easy to solve, right? You're just trying to isolate the x. So you subtract 5 on both sides, and so you have 2x equals 5. And then you divide 2 on both sides, and so x equals 2.5. Okay, that was me solving a linear equation. However, a quadratic equation is much more different. Much more different. That was terrible. Much different. Okay, so first off, you need to understand that there are 4 different ways to solve a quadratic equation. There are 4 ways to solve a quadratic equation. And hopefully by the end of this unit, you'll be able to solve a quadratic equation all 4 ways. Now, the first way you've already learned. It's by graphing. So when you solve a quadratic equation by graphing, you're looking for the zeros of the function, or the x-intercepts. Okay, so the solution to a quadratic equation is where the graph touches the x-axis. The solution to a quadratic equation, when you're solving it by graphing, is to see where it touches the x-axis. So if I were to draw a little coordinate plane on my iPad here, and I drew a quadratic equation graph, you can see that right here it touches the x-axis, and right here it touches the x-axis. So those are the 2 solutions. So you see right here in my linear equation, I said x equals 2.5. When this particular example, x would equal whatever this is, and x would equal whatever this is. Quadratic equations normally have 2 answers because it's a second degree polynomial. Now, the second way you can solve a quadratic equation is by factoring. Factoring. Okay, now factoring is like if I have x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. Factoring is when you split it into 2 binomials like this. And you say, okay, this is x and this is x. And what times what gives me 1? Well, 1 times 1 does. So I say plus 1 because 1 times 1 is 1 and 1 plus 1 is 2. Okay, so the first way to solve is by graphing. The second way is by factoring. Okay, the third way we'll learn is called complete the square. Okay, and then the final way is called the quadratic formula. And you'll just have to memorize this formula. I'd encourage you to go on YouTube and just type in like quadratic formula song and watch a few of the songs. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. And so this is what you're trying to do over the next week or so. If I give you a second degree polynomial equation like this one or like this one, your goal is to solve it one of these 4 ways, or whichever one I specify. If you solve it by graphing, you're looking for where the graph touches the x-axis. If you solve it by factoring, you solve it by splitting it into 2 binomials. And then you can complete the square or use the quadratic formula. Okay, and I have videos on complete the square and quadratic formula in the quadratic section of the website. So here's the book that I'm using this year to teach, and you can see that Chapter 9 is solving quadratic equations. And you can see that Section 9.2 is solving quadratic equations by graphing. Section 9.3 is solving quadratics using the square root. Section 9.4 is solving quadratic equations by completing the square. And Section 9.5 is solving quadratics using the quadratic formula. Now, they didn't include factoring in the section because we've already done it.